Today, October 7th, 2024, marks the 105th birthday of Dutch carrier KLM. The airline is the oldest in the world which still operates under its original name. In this special edition of the Inside Story, we will take a look at the airline's rich history, as well as what is in store for the future. Without further ado, let's get into it. The KLM brand originated from an aviation exhibition in Amsterdam back in 1919, which was spearheaded by a young aviator named Albert Plesman. Attendance at this exhibition stood at over 500,000, and after it closed, commercial interest was strong enough to establish an airline in the Netherlands. By September of that year, Queen Wilhelmina awarded the yet-to-be-founded carrier with a royal predicate. On October 7, 1919, 8 Dutch businessmen founded KLM as one of the first commercial airlines, with Albert Plesman assigned as the first administrator and director. By May 1920, the first flight from London Croydon Airport to Amsterdam took place using a leased de Havilland DH-16 aircraft. By the end of 1920, KLM had handled just 440 passengers and 22 tons of freight, which back then was a big deal. The winter in 1920 saw the airline pause operations before resuming operations again in April 1921 using Fokker 2 and Fokker 3 aircraft. It was at that point that the airline had started scheduled services. Within 3 years, KLM started exploring intercontinental flights, with the first experimental flight taking place on October 1st, 1924, which is now 100 years ago. By September 1929, the airline had regular scheduled services between Amsterdam and Batavia, following a few years of successes on the intercontinental route. Until World War II, this was the world's longest distance scheduled service by aircraft. Between 1926 and 1929, KLM was already offering flights to the likes of Rotterdam, Brussels, Paris, London, Bremen, Copenhagen and Malmö. By the end of the 1920s, KLM had handled over 15,000 passengers, a significant improvement over the previous 10 years. In 1936, KLM received Douglas DC-3 aircraft, which enabled the airline to replace its older DC-2 aircraft on the Amsterdam-Batavia-Sydney flights. 2 years after, KLM became the first airline to serve Manchester's new Ringway Airport. As the Second World War developed, this restricted KLM's operations, with many flights over France and Germany prohibited, resulting in the airline having to paint its aircraft orange to prevent confusion by Allied and Axis forces, reducing the risk of the aircraft being shot down. During the war also, KLM had to send their aircraft out to military deployment, which resulted in them signing lease agreements with BOAC to keep scheduled flights going. On top of this, whilst European operations were restricted, KLM offered flights in and around the Caribbean to remain afloat. By the end of the Second World War, KLM began to rebuild its network, and by May 1946 they became the first continental European carrier to start transatlantic flights between Amsterdam and New York, utilising the newer Douglas DC-4 aircraft. By 1948, KLM had a lot of their previous route network restored, which by 1950 enabled the airline to handle over 350,000 passengers. During the post-war period also, the Dutch government expressed interest in gaining a majority stake, but Albert Plesman wanted the carrier to remain private, allowing the government to only take a minority stake in the airline at the time. In December 1953, Plesman unfortunately died, with von Zeller succeeding Plesman as the president of KLM. After his death, the airline entered a difficult time financially, with the conversion to jet aircraft costing the airline a lot of money. This resulted in the Dutch government increasing its ownership of the company to 2/3, which resulted in a part nationalisation of the airline. The next piston aircraft KLM acquired was the Douglas DC-7C, which enabled the airline to operate flights from Amsterdam to Tokyo via Anchorage. It was after that point when the airline fully entered the jet age. By March 1960, KLM had begun to dabble its hand in the jet era through the introduction of the Douglas DC-8 into its fleet. It was also at this point where the financial difficulty got somewhat worse. In 1961, the airline had reported its first year of losses, with the then president von Zeller replaced by Ernst van der Beugel. This leadership change didn't lead to a reversal of KLM's financial position, with van der Beugel resigning in 1963 on health grounds. Horatius Albarda became his successor and began to reorganise the company, resulting in job losses and a reduction in flight services. The look in leadership changes continued to be negative, with Albarda having to be replaced due to his death in a plane crash, and once again another appointment was made, being Dr. Gerrit van der Waal. In 1966, Van der Waal agreed a deal with the Dutch government to reduce their stake to a 49.5% minority position, enabling KLM to become a private airline once again. This enabled the airline to also introduce the Douglas DC-9 on European and Middle East routes. By March 1967, the airline had placed an order for the Boeing 747 and received delivery of the Dash 200 variant by February 1971. By 1972, KLM had also placed an order for the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, which was an aircraft built in response to the 747. In the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, this forced KLM to once again speak with the Dutch government about debt refinancing. Additional shares had been issued, and by 1978, the Dutch government owned around 78% of the airline, which once again resulted in a part nationalisation of the carrier. By the 1980s, KLM was handling close to 10 million passengers per year, and with that expansion saw orders for more Boeing 747 aircraft, as well as for the Airbus A310 too. By 1986, after more successful years, KLM managed to reduce the Dutch government stake from 78% down to 54.8%. Such growth had also enabled KLM to acquire the Boeing 747-400, the most popular variant of the jumbo jet, by June 1989. The 1990s saw KLM elevate its growth further by developing its hub at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport to the point that they were feeding their network with traffic from other carriers. On top of this, KLM acquired a 20% stake in Northwest Airlines, and at that point had increased their annual passenger intake to 16 million passengers. By December 1991, KLM became the first European airline to introduce a frequent flyer loyalty program known as the Flying Dutchman. In January 1993, the US DOT granted KLM and Northwest Airlines antitrust immunity, which enabled them to grow their partnership. As part of a joint venture, flights between Amsterdam and the United States intensified, with the Dutch carrier increasing their stake in Northwest Airlines to 25% by 1994. It was also in the 90s where the fleet makeup of KLM had developed significantly, acquiring aircraft such as the Boeing 767-300ER, the McDonnell Douglas MD-11, the Boeing 777-200ER, and the Airbus A330-200. The new millennium saw a new era for KLM. In September 2003, the carrier had agreed a merger plan with Air France where they would become subsidiaries of a holding company that we now know as Air France-KLM today. By February 2004, this merger was approved by the European Commission and the United States Department of Justice. Following Northwest Airlines' merger with Delta Airlines in 2008, it created a makeup where Air France, KLM and Delta became part of the SkyTeam Alliance, a membership that was ratified in September 2004. By September 2010, KLM had made another move in the Dutch aviation space, being the integration of the Martin Air passenger division into the mainline KLM feed. By November 2011, Martin Air only provided cargo and maintenance within this. By 2012, KLM had made history with the first transatlantic flight fueled partly by sustainable biofuels to Rio de Janeiro from Amsterdam. This was the longest distance any aircraft had flown on biofuels at the time. Between 2013 and 2014, the airline went through some more leadership changes, with Peter Elbers, who is now the CEO of Indigo, taking the airline to its next step in its journey. In 2019, KLM celebrated its centennial anniversary, marking 100 years since the company had been founded. However, the year after would provide another era in financial difficulty for the Dutch carrier. During the COVID-19 pandemic, KLM had to cut a whopping 6,000 jobs from its operation. On top of this, the decision made by governments that all passengers and crew needing to be tested for COVID also had an impact on flights. Despite this, in December 2021, Air France-KLM made an order for 100 Airbus A320neo family aircraft to be divided between Transavia and KLM. The A321neos have recently been incorporated into the KLM and Transavia fleets in the last year or two. After 2021, things began to restore once again for KLM, turning over strong profits and handling over 30 million passengers by 2023. Nowadays, the airline has a fleet of 109 aircraft, focusing mainly on Boeing at this point, but is expected to shift to more of an equal split towards Airbus in the long-term future. As briefly mentioned, KLM is in the process of starting its fleet renewal. The airline has started to receive Airbus A321neo aircraft and has new Airbus A330 aircraft on the way over the next few years. This is going to enable KLM to become a more cleaner, quieter and fuel-efficient airline, which will cut costs and enable further expansion as more aircraft are delivered in the future. Over the last 105 years, KLM has gone through a lot of difficulty, but has come out the other side in a very strong position. From its joint ventures in SkyTeam to its relationship with Air France under the Air France-KLM name, KLM has made a name for itself as one of the staples of the European airline industry. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then be sure to like, comment and subscribe for more videos on the Aviation Source YouTube channel. For now, this has been the Inside Story, and we will see you in the next video.